Today is Saturday, the 17th of August, and over the last 24 hours, the Russian part of the internet has been rife with rumours and claims that Ukraine has been planning some kind of major strike on either the Zaporozhie or the Kursk nuclear power plant, or plants, or perhaps both of them, and that these strikes were supposed to happen either with missiles or possibly with some kind of dirty bomb or all sorts of things like this. I have to say that reading the various reports, the exact provenance of these claims was not clear to me. They seem to come from Russian journalists and an individual who claims to be in charge of some kind of partisan group operating in Nikolaev region of Russia, of Ukraine. So it's not clear to me that one should place an inordinate amount of reliance or weight on these claims, but neither can one completely discount them. I say that because on the assumption, which is the one that I firmly hold, and which I think more and more people have come round to, that the original purpose of the Kursk incursion was to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, and with it becoming increasingly clear that that isn't going to happen, it looks to me as if it is possible that the Ukrainians are now coming up with all sorts of dangerous and wild plans to try to somehow make the most of this operation by perhaps doubling or trebling or quadrupling down in the most reckless and dangerous way. Anyway, I hope these reports are untrue. I can't discount them completely. If they are true, I hope that Western governments have taken heed of them. And I remember that on one occasion, about a year ago, when there were Ukrainian attacks on the Zaporozhie nuclear power plant, there was apparently a stream of telephone calls to Kiev from concerned Western governments telling them to stop doing whatever it was that they were doing. So it is possible that this time the same will happen, and I hope that that is true also. Anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry, for its part, has now weighed in on this and has published a strong warning about what might happen if there is an attack, specifically on the Kursk nuclear power plant of the sort that has been discussed. And this has appeared on the Russian Defense Ministry's website and Telegram channel. The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation gives due serious consideration to evaluating information coming through independent channels about the Kiev regime's preparation for an attack on the Kursk nuclear power plant. Note that they're not saying that they have this information themselves. They are saying that this information is coming from independent channels, in other words, from journalists. And then the Russian Defense Ministry says this, and it's actually quite interesting and rather concerning. The purpose of this provocation is to accuse the Russian Federation of self-fire on the station in order to create grounds for attacks on Ukraine's nuclear power facilities. In other words, that the Ukrainians are thinking of attacking the Kursk nuclear power plant in order to claim that the Russians have staged this incident to give themselves an excuse to attack the Ukrainian nuclear power stations. The three nuclear power plants that are still under Ukrainian control and which still provide electricity to the Ukrainian energy system. By the way, I would say that having destroyed the thermal plants, it is the Ukrainian nuclear power plants that are now pretty much the only providers, domestic providers of electricity to the Ukrainian electricity system. Ukraine does, of course, also import electricity from the European Union, to be precise, principally from Hungary and Slovakia. But the Ukrainian nuclear power stations are now the main providers. And then the Russian Defense Ministry goes on to say, we regard such actions by the Kiev regime, supported by Western countries, as a direct violation of the international convention adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, resolution of 13th April 2005, International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. And then the Russian Defense Ministry goes on to give a warning. In case of the Kiev regime starts implementing criminal plans aimed at creating a man-made disaster in the European part of the continent with radioactive contamination of huge territories, stringent military and military technical measures will be taken immediately. Now, of course, they don't tell us what those are, but that sounds like a very, very threatening warning. I think that Western governments would be well advised to take seriously. Now, let me repeat again. I don't know how much truth there is to any of this. The Ukrainians themselves, obviously, are not saying anything. So it could be that none of this has any basis or reality behind it. It could just be rumors. It might be rumors that are being circulated by the Ukrainians themselves in order to keep the Russians on edge. Or it could be that there's chatter about this in Kiev. There's been discussions of doing this very thing in Kiev on many previous occasions in the war, going all the way back to 2022. Or it could be that this is something that some excited Russian bloggers and journalists are coming up with. Or, of course, it could be true. If it is true, then this is an enormously dangerous development, and we see that the Russian authorities are taking it extremely seriously. Now, I'm not going to press further. I'm not going to speculate too much about what the stringent military and military technical measures will be, but the way that it is expressed seems to me to leave open possibilities for the Russians to use every weapon in their arsenal, including some of the tactical systems that the Russians supposedly have on their borders and about which there have been many discussions in the past. I strongly hope and very much believe that nothing of that nature is going to happen. Anyway, let's move on and let's discuss the overall situation now on the battlefronts. And I'm going to say that yesterday, the last 24 hours were a disastrous day for Ukraine overall. We are seeing major problems with Ukraine's Kursk incursion, which I'm going to come to shortly. But over the last 24 hours, there has been a mass destruction of Ukrainian air and missile assets. Now, before I start on that, I ought to just say that on the day previously, missed by me and not discussed in my enormous video of yesterday, was a report by the Russian Defense Ministry that the Ukrainians made their first serious attempt to attack the Crimean Bridge with 12 ATACMS missiles. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, every one of the missiles was shot down. And it is indeed the case that the Crimean Bridge remains intact. We see that as the situation on the battle lines deteriorates for Ukraine, the Ukrainians are now pulling everything they have playing all their cards, all their remaining cards, in the most desperate way that they can, and that they're becoming increasingly reckless in doing so. And this makes, again, no logical sense. There's been a most interesting article in the Washington Post, which I can't confirm, but which looks to be reliable, that over the last couple of weeks, discussions have been underway, apparently brokered by the Emir of Qatar, to try to achieve some kind of a ceasefire, not in the overall war, but in the missile and drone war between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, as we know, have been making pinprick attacks with drones against the Russian energy system. They've been attacking refineries and such things. As I've said many times, none of this has made the slightest difference to the overall energy situation in Russia, nor has it affected Russian exports of oil and gas, contrary to what some claims say. But the Qataris, who clearly like to present themselves as mediators in this situation, apparently started approaching both the Russians and the Ukrainians, trying to get them to agree to a mutual ceasefire. The idea was that the Ukrainians cease their attacks on Russian refineries and other energy complexes, and in return, the Russians cease their missile attacks on Ukrainian energy facilities. And it could be, and this is a bit of a stretch now, but it could be that attacks on the nuclear power stations were also part of this narrative, that maybe Ukraine had floated, or the Russians had floated, threats from Ukraine about attacks on Russian nuclear power stations, specifically the Kursk nuclear power plant, and that the Qataris said, very well, let's stop all of these attacks and let's end the electricity wars, and the Russians would agree not to attack any more of Ukraine's energy facilities, and in return the Ukrainians would stop their attacks on Russian energy facilities. And I'm going to make a guess that it was perhaps because these discussions were underway, brokered by the Emir of Qatar, that the Russians over the last couple of weeks have held off from more attacks on the Ukrainian energy system. Now, to be very clear, if such an agreement had been reached, it would have been very, very much in Ukraine's favor. The Ukrainian attacks on the Russian energy system have been, as I have said, pinpricks. The Russian attacks on the Ukrainian system have been absolutely devastating. There has been no equivalence in terms of damage done. But the Russians, in a move which perhaps they now sort of regret, have justified their attacks on the Ukrainian energy system. The Russian Defense Ministry repeatedly says this, by citing Ukrainian attacks on their refineries. And given that that is so, and given that the Emir of Qatar is somebody that the Russians are keen to remain on good terms with, it looks as if the Russians were prepared very grudgingly to go ahead with this deal, this agreement. And the Washington Post says that the agreement was almost signed and sealed. The agreements had almost been reached. And then, of course, the Ukrainians launched the Kursk operation. And apparently the Russians are now telling the Qataris, as they are telling everybody else, that in light of the Kursk operation, in light of the threats to the Kursk nuclear power plant, this deal is off. There is no conceivable way that the Russians will agree to any agreement of this kind with a Ukrainian government that they consider to be capable of doing the things that it has done. I just wonder, whether perhaps these reports about Ukrainian plans to attack the Kursk nuclear power plant in particular, but perhaps the Zaporozhie nuclear power plant as well, aren't intended, haven't been leaked by the Russians themselves in order to spike this deal that the Qataris were trying to broker once and for all. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. Now, alongside all of that, yesterday we have had a mass destruction of Ukrainian air defense missiles, air defense systems, and HIMARS launch systems as well. So let's start with what has happened. Firstly, the Ukrainians, as there have been many reports, they've been trying to destroy Russian bridges across the Siem River in Kursk region. This is all apparently in connection with Ukraine's attempts to open up a second front in Kursk region to capture more territory there. Also, supposedly, according to some claims, to prevent Russian civilians evacuating this region. The suggestion is, and it comes from the Russians now, that the Ukrainians want to capture as many civilians as they can, Russian civilians as they can, to hold them in effect as hostages, to force the Russians into negotiation. I don't, again, know whether that is true, but the Russian authorities, the Russian government, undoubtedly still carries the scars of various incidents which took place in the 1990s when jihadi fighters in the northern Caucasus, based in Chechnya, conducted deep raids inside Russia, captured large numbers of Russian civilians and held them hostage. And the Russian authorities at that time felt themselves obliged to conduct all sorts of negotiations, both to release those hostages, but not only to release those hostages, both territorial concessions to the jihadi fighters, and, by the way, payments of substantial amounts of money. This is a shady story, but Ramzan Kadyrov, who is now the very strongly pro-Russian head of the Chechen government inside Russia, he's actually said in the past that the actual mastermind behind those operations was none other than the Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky, who had a role within the Russian government itself, and he carried out these operations for all sorts of shady reasons connected to his own plans, and that apparently he put up some of the ransom money for these hostages and told the jihadi fighters that if they seized hostages in that way, it would provide him with a pretext to give them funding, which might be awkward for him to do through any other mechanism, any other means. Well, I'm not going to get drawn into all that story. It's a story from, well, almost 30 years ago now. All I would say is that the Russian authorities still very much bear the scars of all of that. It was all considered deeply humiliating by the Russian authorities at that time. And whether or not the Ukrainians really do have plans to do anything like that, it's not perhaps surprising that the Russian authorities want to get their civilians out of harm's way as quickly as possible to prevent even the possibility of a similar hostage situation arising. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the Ukrainians carried out various missile attacks, specifically on one bridge in particular across the same river. The purpose of the attack was supposedly to prevent Russian reinforcements from arriving in this area and holding off Ukrainian attacks from across the border, whilst at the same time preventing the Russians evacuating civilians in this area as well. And the bridge was eventually destroyed, supposedly as a result of HIMARS strikes. However, it must be said that within almost minutes of news of the bridge being destroyed, further news came out, apparently backed by photographic evidence, that the Russians have already built pontoon bridges, or at least one pontoon bridge across the same river, and are busy creating lots of others. Now, I've seen pictures of the river in question, and yes, it's a river, but it's a relatively small river. It would be no problem at all, I would have thought, for Russian engineers to be able to build pontoon bridges across a relatively small river like this. So that was the Ukrainian plan. It clearly suffers from significant flaws. But the point is that carrying out this particular operation exposed the HIMARS missile launchers. The Russians have massively upgraded their drone surveillance technologies compared to what was achieved by what the Russians had at the start of the war. They have huge numbers of drones now flying over the skies. They're able to keep what the Ukrainians do under extremely close observation. The Russian Defense Ministry now publishes regular drone footage obtained from these drones of Ukrainian forces. It is extraordinarily high definition and clear, and frankly, HIMARS launchers operating so close to the Russian border within easy sight of the Russian drones are not going to survive for very long. And, well, as Group of Forces North reported yesterday, 2 HIMARS launchers were destroyed almost immediately, and it looks as if significant damage was done. Well, anyway, two launchers were destroyed immediately. And one senses that they were launchers that would be used precisely in order to attack the bridge. There's already a very bitter comment, which I've seen on Twitter X. I'm not sure whether the person who's posted it is a supporter of Ukraine or a supporter of Russia, but he's made the point that this is an incredibly bad trade. The Ukrainians destroyed a bridge, which the Russians have already replaced with pontoon bridges, and in the process they've managed to lose 2 HIMARS launchers. And I think that has to be correct. But that was not the limit of the damage that was done yesterday. And the Russian Defense Ministry, as part of its weekly update, has now provided us with an account of what happened. Operational tactical aviation, unmanned aerial vehicles, missile troops and artillery of the Russian group of forces have destroyed 1 Sukhoi 24 tactical bomber and 3 helicopters of the Ukrainian Air Force, including 2 Mi-8 and Mi-17 helicopters on airfields. And the Russians have provided vivid film of the destruction of this Sukhoi 24 aircraft. You can see the aircraft on the airfield. I'm not sure, by the way, where this airfield is. does not appear to be Staro-Konstantinov. Anyway, there's pictures of the aircraft, and there's various vehicles approaching this aircraft on the airfield. The aircraft was apparently being loaded with Storm Shadow or Scout missiles in preparation for an attack on some Russian target, who knows where. And suddenly we see plumes of smoke, a tremendous fire. It appears that the aircraft and all the surrounding vehicles, and probably the technicians, and for all I know the pilots, were killed in what looks like an Iskander-M strike. So there we go. And the Russians also say that 3 helicopters were destroyed as well. Then the Russian Defense Ministry says that 2 US-made HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems, transport loading vehicles, 4 launchers, 2 US-made HIMARS multiple launch rocket system transport loading vehicles were destroyed. These are the vehicles I've just been talking about. And then comes the real disaster. 4 launchers and 2 US-made AN/MPQ-65 radar stations of the Patriot anti-aircraft missile systems, 1 IRIS-T anti-aircraft missile system launcher, and TRML-4D radar systems, and as well as 1 S-125 anti-aircraft missile system launcher also destroyed. And we have pictures. The Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with film of the missile strikes on all of these systems. So the equivalent of a complete Patriot missile system has again been destroyed. 4 launchers in total. Apparently 2 launchers. There were 3 launchers with 1 radar system and 2 launchers with another. I'm not quite sure how the destroyed launchers ought to be apportioned, but you can see the Iskander-M strikes on both of them. One apparently took place in close to the city of Dnipro. I'm not clear as to where the other strikes took place, nor am I clear where the IRIS-T attack took place as well. And as for the S-125 anti-aircraft missile system, that is a Soviet legacy system left over from the Cold War. It was developed by the Soviet Union in the 1950s. It is similar, in other words, to the US Hawk system. Apparently, the system in question, this S-125, has a Polish provenance. It was supplied to Ukraine by Poland. One must assume that it has been extensively modernized. It probably cannot shoot down Russian missiles or aircraft, but it could be effective against drones. All of them destroyed, all in one day. And perhaps the greatest damage done in these strikes is not to the launchers, but to the radar stations. 2 MPQ-65 radar stations of the Patriot system, 1 TRML-4D radar system of the German IRIS-T. The radars are apparently complex equipment. They take a long time to produce. The destruction of these systems is very difficult to replace. These radar systems is very difficult to replace. So massive damage done to rare and expensive HIMARS systems, 4 Patriot missile launchers, 3 expensive radars, 1 IRIS-T system, 1 S-125 system, all destroyed over the space of a single day. Now, I'm guessing that all of these missiles were, again, deployed reasonably close to the front lines. The Patriot, one of the Patriot missile systems that was attacked and largely destroyed, appears to have been based close to the airfield where the destroyed Su-24 was located. So I'm guessing that these are all forward deployed systems by the Ukrainians. And we see that the Ukrainians trying to go on the attack in Kursk region and in other places. What it is doing is it is causing them to lose extremely expensive and difficult to replace systems. Anti-aircraft, air defense systems, which Ukraine is in critically short supply of. HIMARS launchers, the same. Radars, they've all been lost too. And of course, the other day, we had reports that the Challenger 2 tank had also been destroyed. Well, that's all very bad and very disturbing. But what at the same time is happening on the battlefronts? Well, we have had lots of news from the battlefronts, and it is difficult to keep up sometimes with all of the information that we are getting. But it's clear that the situation in Pokrovsk is becoming incredibly dangerous for the Ukrainians. Things are collapsing around Pokrovsk very fast, and the same appears to be equally true about Toretsk. And also, just to say, though I'm not going to discuss it in detail because the amount of information that we've had at the moment is quite limited, but it looks as if, I saw one report to be precise, which spoke of another significant Russian advance in the Chasiv Yar area that the Russians are pushing forward in Chasiv Yar. But anyway, let's start with Pokrovsk. Firstly, as I said yesterday, the Ukrainian authorities have, in Pokrovsk, have now announced that they want the entire population to evacuate from Pokrovsk. And at the same time, as they've announced that, rather astonishingly, they've also announced a contract for the creation of fortifications around Pokrovsk, a contract that is supposed to be fulfilled in a year's time. And there's a cynical view circulating, which, by the way, I share, that this is someone's scheme to skim money from the budget. The only explanation, because it's at the rate things are going, it's debatable whether the Ukrainians will still be in control of Pokrovsk in a month, let alone a year. But anyway, what exactly is going on around Pokrovsk? Well, first of all, there was confirmation this morning that the Russians have indeed captured the village of Zelanye, which I was speaking about. There are reports that the Russians have pushed south from Zelanye, that they've also captured another village called Novo Zelanye, and that they have also captured a village called Zavitne, and that they're moving south still further towards a village called Ptiche. All of these close to the road linking Selidovo with Karlovka. I've discussed the supply road many times, but there are lots of reports about this. Radovka yesterday, this is the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, nationalist newspaper, very strongly supportive of the special military operation and its objectives. Anyway, Radovka yesterday had a very interesting discussion about what the Russians intend to do next. since the capture, and I should stress this is confirmed capture, of the three villages of Zhuravka, Orlivka, and Mykolaievka. I say confirmed. The Russian Defense Ministry has not yet confirmed them, but virtually everybody accepts and acknowledges, everybody else accepts and acknowledges that they are under Russian control. And the Russian Defense Ministry says, Redovka says, that the Russians do not yet have enough troops to storm the next village of Novogrodivka, which has high-rise buildings and all of that. But an attack on Novogrodivka is likely to happen within days, as soon as enough Russian troops are brought into this area. And the reason is that, as I said, for the moment, the Russians just don't have enough troops to attack Novogrodivka. But neither do the Ukrainians to defend it. They just have enough troops to see off a small skirmishing attack by the Russians. But once the Russians do bring up enough troops, Novogrodivka would fall very fast. And of course, if Novogrodivka falls, they say that Selidovo will fall almost immediately. This is Redovka, that Selidovo is basically, you could describe it as being low ground relative to all of the other places, Novogrodivka specifically. I'm not sure whether that is topographically correct, but if Novogrodivka falls, Selidovo itself, it becomes virtually undefendable. The Russians would be able to capture Selidovo within days. And Redovka then went on to say that if the Russians capture Selidovo, then the entire defense position of the Ukrainians further south, around Kurakhovo, what's left of Krasnogorovka, and Vuhledar itself, will rapidly begin to collapse because of a general shortage of supplies. The main supplies for this part of the front lines goes to these places via Selidovo. Now, I ought to say, if you look at the maps, as I've said many times, I'm not the best person to understand maps. But if you look at the maps, it does seem to me that there are still potential supply routes to, say, Vuhledar from Pavlograd. But with the 79th Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian military, the one that is trying to hold out in Konstantinovka, now today finally confirming what's been known for a long time, that the Russians have crossed and are advancing well beyond the supply road between Konstantinovka and Vuhledar, that they are in fact approaching the village of Odyanie. It's likely that more supply roads to Vuhledar will be cut, and as I said already, if you look at the position of the Russian troops as they move forward in this area of Vuhledar, which is the linchpin of the whole defense system, is now at serious risk of becoming encircled. And the loss, you can see how the loss of Selidovo would make the whole situation extremely difficult. So we can probably look forward to a Russian attack on Novogrodivka very soon, and an attack on Selidovo shortly after. In truth, the entire Ukrainian position in southern Donbas is now looking incredibly precarious. The Ukrainians are holding things together. They're hanging by a thread in this region. If all of these places, Selidovo, Novogrodivka, fall, then it's very difficult to see how the Ukrainians can hold on. Vodyania, the village, fall. It's very difficult to see how the Ukrainians can hold out for very long. And I'm going to make a guess that if they have any rational thinking behind them, they will actually withdraw. So that's, if you like, the situation in southern Donbas. Now, further north, closer to Pokrovsk itself, there's intense fighting going on for the village of Grodivka, which is the main village on the way to Pokrovsk itself. And the reports we're getting is that Ukrainian resistance in this village is collapsing and that the village could fall fully under Russian control by the end of this weekend or by the start of next week. In which case, as I said previously, the next position beyond Grodivka on the main road is Mirnograd itself, a place the Russians call Dmitrov. And of course, if the Russians capture Mirnograd, the way is open for an assault on the central part of Pokrovsk itself. Now, there have been despairing comments by Ukrainian soldiers in this area being conveyed to the Western media. There was a very alarmed comment, which I think I read from a Ukrainian soldier in the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, in which he said that they just don't have enough manpower to resist the Russians. Where they need 5 to 6 men to hold their positions, they only have two or three. He said that the Russians outnumber them by a ratio of around 5 to 1. This is in manpower. And of course, in terms of shells, artillery, and all of that, the situation is absolutely as terrible as always. There has, by the way, been a massive report published by one of the formal study groups in the United States. I skimmed through this and I can't now remember which it was. It wasn't Rand or anyone like that, but it was still a pretty formal one, which said that, as I've discussed many times in many programs, as Brian Beletic has also discussed many times in many programs, Ukraine's shortage of artillery ammunition is nowhere close to being addressed. The Ukrainian situation may be perhaps slightly less critical than it was at the beginning of the spring, but they are still massively outgunned by the Russians, and that's not even taking into account the Russian Air Force's ability to conduct FAB strikes on Ukrainian positions across the entire contact line. So the Ukrainians simply, according to all of these reports, simply do not have enough men to hold the Russians back in the event that Grodivka is captured and the Russians move on to assault Mirnograd and then move on to attack Pokrovsk. All available resources are instead being channeled by Zelensky and Syrskyi to the Kursk direction. And in fact, there's even an astonishing film in which we see Zelensky and Syrskyi talking about the situation in Kursk, and Zelensky is ordering Syrskyi to continue to send more and more men to Kursk. Part of the rationale that the Ukrainians have given for their Kursk offensive is to get the Russians to divert their resources from the Donbas front lines to Kursk to hold the Ukrainians back. What is actually happening is the opposite. Instead of the Russians redeploying their forces from the Donbas. It is the Ukrainians who are, as Zelensky continues to double and triple and quadruple down. And, well, maybe things will turn out otherwise. Maybe the Ukrainians will be able to scratch together enough forces to stop the Russians in Pokrovsk, or at least to slow them down. I don't know. But for the moment, it looks as if the possibility that Pokrovsk could fall within weeks is becoming very real. And when I read reports about some officials in Pokrovsk, as I said, signing off contracts for fortifications which are to be delivered in a year's time, as I said, what many people say is a skimming operation. Well, that's what it looks like to me. It looks as if they too understand that Pokrovsk is about to fall, and they are bailing out, trying to get their hands on however much funding they can before the collapse in Pokrovsk happens. Now, this is critically terrible because I've already discussed in many programs what would happen if Pokrovsk were to fall, the way the Russians might, in theory, be able to advance from Pokrovsk all the way to Pavlograd, bringing and beyond, putting themselves on the east bank of the Dnieper, opposite Dnipro. One wonders what kind of defences Pavlograd, which has so far been far in the rear, has that would be sufficient to stop the Russians. And it's perhaps worth pointing out that if the Russians capture Pokrovsk and capture Toretsk as well, and we'll come to what the situation is like in Toretsk itself, well, then they have the TO 504 highway entirely under their control, and they can drive up that highway, they can send their supplies along that highway, and they can then move west of Pokrovsk along the E50 highway, again, a very strong, very good highway. They can supply their troops, in other words, keep their troops supplied through one of the main roads as they advance all the way to Pavlograd and to Dnipro itself. A catastrophic situation. And we are beginning to see, alongside the usual boilerplate articles that are appearing in parts of the media in the West, about the triumphant successes of the Ukrainians in Kursk, which we'll come to shortly, we can start to see the alarm and the doubts start to appear. There's an article, for example, in the Financial Times, which downplays the whole situation. Ukraine orders evacuation in east amid steady Russian gains. More territory in Donetsk region is taken, whilst Kiev presses ahead with its cross-border incursion into Kursk. You get almost a sense there of skepticism for the first time about how critical the situation is becoming. And in fact, the article, which is unusual for an article in the British media, is surprisingly factual about the overall military situation that the Ukrainians face. I would add that the American media, the US media, has been altogether more measured in its accounts of what's happening in the battlefields in Kursk and Pokrovsk and elsewhere than the British media has been, which is perhaps unsurprising. Anyway, very, very bad situation in Pokrovsk. I'm not yet going to come out and say that Pokrovsk is about to fall, because I don't know exactly what the situation in the town is, but I'm starting to think that that might be a distinct possibility. And as I said, it could be that perhaps before the end of this month, the Russians might indeed be in control of Pokrovsk. The other place where there's been intense fighting over the last few weeks that we know about is Toretsk. And here the situation for the Ukrainians is becoming equally disastrous. Firstly, maps which have now been released show huge belts of territory on the southern outskirts of Toretsk falling under Russian control. The Russians have captured, this is accepted apparently even by Ukrainian mappers, all of the territory of the village of Pivnichne, including the coal mines. The coal mine that was located immediately to the west of Pivnichne, which was supposedly a fortified position that the Ukrainians held on the route to Toretsk. And apparently the Russians have now entered the area of high-rise buildings at the far east of Toretsk. It's described as the Toretsk citadel, similar to the Volchansk citadel. That area is apparently also falling unusually fast. The Russians, this according to the very latest reports, confirming that the Russians up to now have not been in complete control of New York, but the reports are suggesting that all of New York is going to fall fully under Russian control over the course of today. Probably by the time you're watching this program, it will have fully passed under Russian control. Some Ukrainian troops apparently cut off. There's talk of cauldrons and that kind of thing. And anyway, the point is that if this area of high-rise buildings at the eastern end of Toretsk is captured by the Russians, then apparently the rest of Toretsk becomes undefendable. And it could be the case that Toretsk also will fall within the next couple of days. I wonder whether these dramatic developments, this dramatic collapse of Ukrainian resistance in northeastern Toretsk isn't partly connected with the reports that were appearing yesterday of a Russian advance from Kurdyumovka over the aqueduct, the Seversky Donetsk aqueduct towards Toretsk from the north, that the Ukrainians had to redeploy forces from Toretsk itself to try to hold the Russian forces that are advancing from Kurdyumovka back, and that this opened the way for Russian troops in Pivnichne to capture the coal mine and to break into the high-rise building area. The key point, again, is that the Ukrainians do not have enough troops to hold back the Russians. This has been the story of the entire Toretsk battle ever since it first started. Now, bear in mind, if Toretsk falls, the next big city north of Toretsk is none other than Konstantinovka. And we have a situation where the main highway from Pokrovsk is falling westwards towards Konstantinovka, is potentially also under Russian control before long. There's, by the way, some reports that the Russians have captured a village called Novoekonomichne, which is located on the highway, but I'm not sure that that is correct. Anyway, there is a distinct possibility that this highway might soon fall under Russian control. and the Russians could soon be advancing northwards towards Konstantinovka. And of course, if this happens, if Konstantinovka also falls, if Toretsk also falls, again, if you look at a map with the Russians advancing towards Konstantinovka from the south, it becomes impossible to see how the Ukrainians can continue to resist for much longer in Chasiv Yar, where, as I said, I've heard reports that the Russians have made further advances there over the last 24 hours. To repeat again, if the Russians capture Chasiv Yar, Konstantinovka, after they've captured Toretsk and are in control of Pokrovsk, they control all the entire stretch of the main road, all the way from Bakhmut, all the way west to Pavlograd and Dnipro. All the way from the east, from Bakhmut, all the way to the west, in Pavlograd and Dnipro. And it seems to me that at that point, the entire defense system in the south and center of Donbas will very, very rapidly collapse. And we could be within weeks of finding ourselves in that situation. But, as I've said, Zelensky continues to be focused instead on his Kursk offensive. He seems to have a psychological need, very common with some people, to appear to be on the attack. And, well, he is, also he appears to think, on the attack in the Kursk region, and therefore he wants to press forward with that attack, even as everything else is collapsing around him. And, well, here we now get more reports from the Russians about what is going on in this area also. So let's first of all begin with what we're being told by Group of Forces North about the situation in Kursk region and, by the way, in Kharkiv as well. This is the only area, Kharkiv and Kursk region, where the Ukrainians still have rough numerical parity with the Russians, perhaps even some degree of superiority over the Russians. Anyway, this is what Group of Forces North says. Remember, they provide separate reports from the main Russian Defense Ministry report, and they're very interesting. On August 16th, Group of Forces North continued to destroy the enemy in the border areas of Kursk region. Fierce battles unfolded in the Korenovo direction. The Group of Forces North repelled 3 attacks of the Ukrainian military in the direction of Korenovo. October 10th, this is a village, by the way, and Troitskoye. The enemy amounted to more than 120 troops, 3 tanks, 12 armored vehicles. They had no success, lost up to 30 men, a tank was destroyed, and 3 TBMs. I'm not quite sure what those are. Anyway, there we go. And then Group of Forces North says this: the Ukrainian military continues its attempts to capture Sudzha from the north and south. Now, as I've discussed in various programs, and as Zelensky said yesterday, the Ukrainians claim to have captured Sudzha. 2 days ago, Abdialaudinov, the Chechen commander, denied that this was the case. He said that the Russian military still has troops inside eastern Sudzha. There were reports after that, following those pictures of the Ukrainians pulling down a Russian flag on a building, that the Ukrainians were in complete control of Sudzha. Zelensky went on to say that, But here we have Group of Forces North basically telling us that part of Sudzha remains under Russian control. And then they talk about a very tough encounter battle. In the area of Ruskoye, Porechnoye, and Kozitsa, the enemy made a breakthrough with two groups totaling up to 120 fighters, 15 armored vehicles, but was met with dense fire. In the first 5 minutes of the battle, the enemy lost 3 armored vehicles and then 3 more. In total, we destroyed more than 35 Ukrainian soldiers. The attack has been repulsed. Also from the south, the enemy is trying to attack Cherkasskaya, Konopelka and Ulanek. So what the Group of Forces North is telling us is that the Ukrainians made another major attempt to break through north of Sudzha to capture these 2 villages that we've been hearing quite a lot about, the villages of Ruskoye, Porechnoye, and Cherkasskoye, Porechnoye, which are located to the northwest of Martinovka. They broke through and reached those villages, but the Russians appear to have counterattacked. After intense fighting, the Ukrainians were pushed back. And this appears to be corroborated by something that Aludinov, Commander Aludinov, has also said. He said this: "We had a very busy and difficult day. Heavy fighting was going on all day from early morning. The enemy was throwing all possible and impossible forces in our direction," which is, by the way, again, these 2 villages. "Today, it turns out we have destroyed 5 armored combat vehicles, 5 pickups, 1 mine-clearing drone, 2 trucks, and 1 tank. We destroyed everything that came to our hands today." And he says the enemy is throwing all the forces and means that it has. Basically, we're happy about this because where we are confident to let the enemy gather everything as he's planning already. God is on our side. He will not let us lose. We will completely destroy all the enemy's reserves. So a very, very tough battle in this northern direction. And according to Group of Forces North, the Ukrainians were repelled. Group of Forces North also says that the Ukrainians made another attack to push from southern Sudzha eastward towards a village called Ulanek, and that this attack is continuing. There's been encounter battles in this direction as well. The Ukrainians has previously got as far as a village called Giri, and then they were pushed back, and it doesn't seem, however, that they were very successful. And note that Group of Forces North says nothing about the situation to the west, in the area where the bridge was destroyed. There's been many reports that the Ukrainians have tried attacks in that direction as well. Other Russian reporters are saying that all of those attacks so far have been repulsed. The Russian Defense Ministry has clearly decided that for the moment they're going to maintain a regime of silence about what is going on in that area, where some Russian reporters are saying that there is a major Ukrainian attack being prepared, with the Ukrainians hoping to capture the entire territory south of the same river. Well, we'll see. Anyway, Group of Forces North then goes on to say, in the Volchansk direction, fighting continues in Volchansk. We disrupted the transfer of reinforcements in the east. Up to 9 Ukrainian soldiers were killed by artillery fire. So they're not giving us much information about what's going on in Volchansk. But then they go on to say this: the enemy became more active in the area of Staritsa. During the day, 3 assault groups tried to break into the settlement. So that is confirmation from Group of Forces North that they control Staritsa. There have been claims in the past that the Ukrainians recaptured that village. Group of Forces North is telling us that this is not true, that they in fact control Staritsa. And then they say that artillery fire damage was inflicted, enemy losses amounted to 10 soldiers. So they imply, even though they don't quite say, that the attack on Staritsa was a failure. They then talk about Lipsy. They say in Lipsy, we completely cleared the private sector west of Gluboka from Ukrainian forces. Up to 5 Ukrainian fighters were killed and 1 was taken prisoner. Over the past 24 hours, the enemy losses amounted to 450 people, more than 300 of them in the Sumy direction. And they also claim to have destroyed, along with everything else, 2 tanks and the 2 HIMARS vehicles that we were talking about. And the S-125 SAM system, they say, was destroyed in this area. And then they say this: at the time when we are grinding up the enemy, information has circulated about an ongoing, upcoming provocation at the Kursk nuclear power plant, the reports I was talking about at the beginning. This may indicate that the Kiev regime was holding such an option in the case the rush to Kurchatov failed. So what they're saying is that since the Ukrainians have failed to reach the Kursk nuclear power plant, they may have a plan B, which is to launch some kind of a missile or drone or artillery strike against it. And they then go on to say, this shows once again that Zelensky and his handlers do not care about the population of Ukraine, which will feel the full force of our retaliatory strike if such an attempted provocation is made by Kiev. Victory will be ours. And then amazingly, they quote none other than Winston Churchill. They say you cannot win a war under the slogan of caution first. Well, there we go. Group of Forces North, as I said, has this very interesting website. It is unique amongst Russian military websites in having a distinct, one might almost say human, personality. Anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry, for its part, has now also provided its own account of what is going on in Kursk region. And as I said, always this is slightly different from the one provided by Group of Forces North. Overall, they tend to correspond, but they do give us a slightly different flavour of what's happening. They say our armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to repel Ukrainian attempts to invade the territory of the Russian Federation. Units of Group of Forces North, supported by Army aviation and artillery, actively conduct actions to search for and destroy in wooded areas mobile enemy groups that were trying to break through deep into the territory of the Russian Federation in the direction of Alexeyevsky and Kauchuk. Exactly what I have discussed and what my source was telling me about: the Russians setting up ambush parties in the forested areas, destroying mobile units, mobile reconnaissance groups of the Ukrainian forces, as they still try to push northwards in the general direction of Lvov and of Kurchatov and of the nuclear power plant. Anyway, they then say this: attacks launched by assault detachments of the 22nd, 115th Mechanized and 95th Assault Brigades, supported by armoured vehicles, have been repelled in the direction of Korenovo, Ruskoye and Cherkaskoye Porechnoye. So this is again a reference to the attack on Ruskoye and Cherkaskoye Porechnoye that Group of Forces North was talking about, and which Alaudinov was also talking about. They say that this attack was defeated. They also say that aviation, artillery and defending troops have routed the enemy. So this attack was unsuccessful. As a result of these unsuccessful actions, the Ukrainians lost 1 tank and 11 armoured fighting vehicles. And then they go on to say that clusters of Ukrainian manpower and hardware, the 22nd, 61st and 115th Mechanized and 82nd Air Assault Brigades have been hit near Novaya Sorochina, Lyubimovka, southeast of Korenovo, Leonidivka and Kozitsa. Kozitsa is also close to where this particular battle happened. And they go on to say that 1 IRIS-T SAM system launcher and 1 TRML-4D multiple role radar station have been destroyed by missile strikes in Sumy region. Operational tactical aviation hit reserves of the armed forces of Ukraine, ammunition and fuel depots close to Kianitsa, Kozitsa, Khoten and Boyaro Lezachi. And then they give an overall assessment of Ukrainian losses. They said that Ukrainian losses were up to 300 Ukrainian troops, corresponding closely, exactly this time, with what Group of Forces North say, and a high rate of loss, by the way. 30 armoured vehicles, including 3 tanks, 1 infantry fighting vehicle, 3 armoured personnel carriers, 24 armoured fighting vehicles, as well as 8 motor vehicles, 1 IRIS-T SAM system, 1 field artillery system, and 1 electronic warfare system. And then they give an overall assessment of the total number of losses the Ukrainians have suffered over the course of the Kursk operation. They say that the Ukrainians have lost 3,160 troops killed and wounded, 44 tanks, 43 armoured personnel carriers, 26 infantry fighting vehicles, 244 armoured vehicles, 111 motor vehicles, 5 surface-to-air missile systems, 6 multiple launch rocket systems, including 3 HIMARS, 24 field artillery guns, and 4 electronic warfare stations. And they've also provided lots of pictures of Russian helicopter gunships, Mi-28s and Kamov 52s, which are on the prowl in the skies over Kursk and the neighbouring regions, hunting Ukrainian troops on the ground. Now, I think that we can see that the situation for the Ukrainians is deteriorating very, very fast. I've already discussed how Kursk, the incursion into Kursk, is turning into a trap. The Ukrainians are being bled dry in Kursk, even as their front lines crumble. They're not achieving so far anything in Kursk except losing large numbers of men and valuable machines. As I said, you can see lots of doubts in the West about this entire operation. And in the meantime, the Russians are capitalizing on this quagmire that the Ukrainians have created for themselves in Kursk by pushing hard in places like Toretsk, Pokrovsk, first and foremost, Selidovo, probably Chasiv Yar as well. These operations, to repeat again, this Kursk operation is far from turning the situation round for Ukraine, is accelerating the Ukrainian collapse. Ukraine is going faster and faster through its resources, even whilst its positions crumble, and even as Kursk is turning, as I said, into a trap. Now, there are many contradictory reports in the West about the West's role in authoring this debacle. The reports, for example, that have been appearing, I think it was the London Times, that the Ukrainian troops who participated in the Kursk offensive received training in Britain, all somehow suggesting or hinting that the British did actually have some sort of a role in the Kursk operation, and the fact that Challenger 2 tanks have been used in it might also reinforce that view. There are also multiple reports in the British media that the British have been very keen to help the Ukrainians conduct Storm Shadow missile strikes on Russian positions inside Russia, specifically in Kursk region and the areas around, but that the United States has other views and has vetoed that idea for the moment. There are reports that the United States is open to supplying Ukraine with long-range air-launched missiles, which can be operated by the F-16s, but those are unlikely to be available for use before the end of this year and have no bearing at all, therefore, on this operation. So, a lot of confusion there. The British, perhaps more involved in this than they like to admit. The Americans, one gets the sense some Americans are enthusiastically backing this attack. Others much more concerned and deeply skeptical as they see that the purported plan, either to push the Russians into negotiations by seizing the nuclear power station or to get the Russians to divert forces from the Donbas, none of that is playing out as intended. Now, I'm going to here express my own view. This is my own unsolicited advice to the Ukrainian authorities. Firstly, if the Washington Post story is true, that an opportunity to negotiate what would have been a highly favourable truce in terms of the missile wars was thrown away by the Kursk operation, that this plan, this truce, was almost apparently agreed through the good offices of the Emir of Qatar. Well, if that's true, then the Ukrainians have thrown away something which would have been hugely to their advantage, and that further demonstrates that all of these operations that they're conducting in Kursk and elsewhere are completely misconceived. I've already discussed how China seems to be furious with the Ukrainians, and by the way, the Americans, that this operation in Kursk region was launched. Qatar must be very upset and angry as well. I suspect that if those negotiations at Qatar really were underway, they were a sign that some kind of further negotiation to agree a general end to the conflict was probably being pushed hard by some of the Gulf states and by the BRICS group. And all of that has now been wrecked, even though it would have rescued Ukraine from the catastrophic position in which it found itself in. So that tells us that these decisions to launch these cross-border raids made by the trinity of Zelensky, Podolyak and Yermak, backed by and implemented by the disastrous duo of Sirsky and Budanov, that all of these plans are horribly ill-judged. Ukraine has burnt up much of its credit through these attempts. I think the Emir of Qatar is going to be much more wary about engaging in more mediation efforts from this point on, and so will the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Indians and all of the others. So it seems to me that given that this is so, and given the critical situation on the front lines, what Ukraine needs to do is to do what that recent op-ed in the New York Times suggested. Tell the Russians that they are indeed proposing to withdraw completely from Kursk region and from the rest of the 4 regions, perhaps even pull back the greater part of their forces beyond the Dnieper River, and also confirm to the Russians that they agree to neutrality. Now, that cannot happen while Zelensky and his people remain in control in Kiev. And that means that over the next couple of weeks, Ukraine needs to change its leadership. Not only is it all but inconceivable now that the Russians will negotiate with the existing leadership in Kiev, but it's highly likely that all of the available mediators, except perhaps India, have lost faith in it and have ceased to feel that it has carries any further credibility. The Russians have given a hint as to who they think they might be able to negotiate with, and that is the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, the Verkhovnaya Rada. He is a member of Zelensky's party. There's nothing about him that suggests that he is in any way has different views from Zelensky itself, but he's not contaminated by being a member of Zelensky's team in quite the same way that all of the others are. So I think a decision should be made for the parliament. Well, I think the optimal outcome would be for the parliament to tell Zelensky that things are all played out, that he needs to step down, that the parliament needs to assume control, and the parliament should then contact the Russians, the head of the parliament should then contact the Russians and try to find some way towards reaching peace. There is precedent for this. In February 2014, after the Maidan forces gained control of Kiev, the Ukrainian parliament, which had previously backed President Yanukovych and which was dominated by President Yanukovych's party, switched sides, went over completely to the side of the Maidan movement, passed a series of laws and decrees, which in effect created a new power structure in Ukraine and basically inaugurated the Maidan era in Ukrainian history. What could happen now is the reverse of that. Just saying. And I think that is the only way, because at some point over the next couple of weeks, months at most, all of these places that we've been talking about, Pokrovsk, Selidovo, Toretsk, Chasov Yar, Volchansk, will all fall under Russian control. We will have a situation where the Ukrainians will be forced to withdraw from Vuhledar, or Vuhledar will be encircled. the Russians might start moving westwards towards Pavlograd, and there would only be isolated forces left in Konstantinovka and Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, controlled by Ukraine, and it's impossible to see how they would be able to resist for very long. We're not at that point yet, but it is now coming visibly into view over the time horizon. Time, therefore, is short. The sooner this is done, the better, because we are much closer now to collapse than we have ever been, and collapse might just be a few weeks or months away. That's my suggestion. Will it happen? Almost certainly not, but one can only suggest and see. Now, before I finish this program, I want to just mention that there's been a most alarming comment by the Israeli Foreign Minister, Mr. Katz. He's had meetings and discussions with European leaders, European foreign ministers, and he then issued a statement that if Iran launches some kind of a strike against Israel, not only will Israel itself launch counter-strikes against Iran itself, but that Israel expects that the United States, Britain and France and other Western countries will attack Iran alongside it. Now, within hours, that was semi-retracted. The readout that was published by the Israeli Foreign Ministry omitted the words about the Western powers assisting Iran in an aerial offensive against Iran. But I must say that this comment that Mr. Katz has made is completely in line with the tone and language of the five-power statement made by the United States, Britain, France, and Italy, Germany and Italy on Monday, which, as I said, spoke about Iranian aggression, Iranian involvement in terrorist movements, said nothing about Ismail Haniyeh at all, and appeared to place the entire onus of the crisis on Iran. If we are really moving in that direction, if undertakings of that kind have been made in private, and as I said, it's not impossible that they have been, given the type of leaders that these countries have, then we are on the brink of a catastrophe. Notice that Western electorates, European electorates, have not been consulted about this. If we find ourselves in the West in an open-ended confrontation with Iran, well, God help us all, is all I can say. Anyway, this is a topic I propose to return to in my next program. Let me finish now. Let me say again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget that you can check out our shop, where you'll find all sorts of amazing things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.